Hello and welcome to Lifting the Lid, a podcast from the Global Philadelphia Association. Today we are focusing on a subject pertinent and very important to Philadelphia, the African American story, culture and its roots in Philadelphia. We're very grateful to have three fantastic guests who know this landscape well, and I'm happy to introduce to you this afternoon Gwen Ragsdale, President of Lest We Forget Museum, Patrick Grossi, Director of Advocacy for the Preservation Alliance, and Ivan Henderson, Vice President of Programming for the African American Museum of Philadelphia. And let's start today by talking and asking each of them what their role is in Philadelphia with regards to African American culture. Gwen, if you'd like to go first, we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm with the Lest We Forget Slavery Museum. We are the only slavery museum in Philadelphia and the only museum with actual slavery artifacts, such as branding irons and shackles and other forms of ironware, as well as documents and other forms of items that were used during the transatlantic slave trade. So we're located in the Germantown area, which is considered the backyard of Philadelphia, so to speak. But we are very happy to be where we are because it's a very historic part of Philadelphia with a lot of interesting information that we can share with you.
Terrific. Patrick.
I'm Patrick Grossi. I'm Director of Advocacy with the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. The Preservation Alliance is a historic preservation advocacy group. We're a nonprofit. We've been around since 1996. And so in my role as Director of Advocacy, I do a lot of things, but chief among them is kind of working with city offices and then also helping to identify properties across the city that we think are worthy of historic recognition. So obviously African American heritage sites are a big part of that, and it's something that the Alliance has focused on a fair amount over the last 20 to 30 years, I would say. So the best part of my job is that it has me literally all over the city, and there are literally African American heritage sites all over this city. So there's a lot to be done.
You must surely have a lot of knowledge through that exposure, Patrick.
A little bit.
And Ivan, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'd love to start by finding out what you do at the Museum of African American History.
So I'm the Vice President of Programming at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, where we house objects related to the lives and experience of African Americans in Philadelphia and the surrounding region, as well as African Americans in general. We've been open since 1976. We're actually the oldest municipally funded institution of our type that's dedicated to exploring these stories of the diaspora. Through my work, I support our Director of Curatorial Services, the folks who maintain our collection, as well as the programmers who produce all those sort of interpretive experiences that folks come to museums for. I support them in creating new experiences around some of the same old objects that have been in our collection for decades, as well as all of the new objects and ideas that are produced every day. So through those people and through our staff, I'm able to aid in the stewardship, both of those objects, but also the legacies that they contain.
That must be a really fascinating role, Ivan. Obviously, this is a vast subject, a subject very pertinent to our city because of its historical roots and the fact that Philadelphia really is at the foundation of our country, but was also an important location, obviously, on the Underground Railroad. And I think perhaps a little historical perspective to this could be very helpful. And Gwen, I'd like you to give a little start with that, if you wouldn't mind giving that a try.
Sure. As I mentioned, we're located in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, and Germantown has a long history as it relates to slavery, quite frankly. We're located just a few blocks away from the Johnson House, which is a former Underground Railroad site and said to be a spot where Harriet Tubman hid slaves during that period of time. And just a few blocks up from the Johnson House is the Cliveden, a former slave plantation where they have reenactments every summer. So being a part of the Germantown Consortium and being in that part of Philadelphia really puts us on the map in terms of being able to not only share the history of Germantown and what happened at the time, but to be also able to share our objects, which are, they tell their own stories and make you understand how different coming to America was for enslaved Africans. To be able to look at an actual shackle and to be able to touch it to some degree really brings history alive. And what we do is give a review of slavery from capture to emancipation and beyond, so that our visitors get a full story of how slavery impacted African and African Americans, and how to some degree slavery still has vestiges of slavery in our communities today.
Patrick, could you give a little insight as to the timelines of this story in terms of Philadelphia and the different periods, and how this translated with perhaps some of the examples that Gwen is talking to?
Yeah, so maybe an easier way of thinking about it is you cannot sufficiently tell the story of the United States without also recounting the experience of African Americans. And Philadelphia is a place that can kind of uniquely tell that complete story, both in terms of kind of the earlier slavery narratives like Gwen was just talking about, but on through the century, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, both in terms of demographics, obviously, but also in terms of a large free black population, the largest in the United States for most of that period that we're talking about, and an incredible history of entrepreneurs, business people, businessmen and women, musicians, artists, civil rights leaders, political leaders, and you can tell the whole story through the lens of the Philadelphia Black experience. So part of my job is to kind of identify the places that help us tell that story, but in the abstract, Philadelphia is kind of uniquely situated to tell that story.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm a newcomer to Philadelphia. I'm visiting from France, let's say, and I'm really interested in that story. What's my one-stop shop, or how do I better understand the whole perspective of the great point that you just made?
Well, I could point to Ivan as a starting point, for sure. And I would leave it to him to talk about what the museum does to tell that story. Short of the African American Museum, I don't know that there is a one-stop shop, right? Because the story is incredibly layered and touches other narratives that maybe on the face of them don't have to do with the African American experience, but absolutely these multiple narratives are all kind of touching each other over the course of history.
Right. Do you provide a walking tour or walking tours that kind of illustrate what we just talked about?
We offer a series of walking tours. Many of them are kind of architecturally oriented. In the past, we've done tours of the 7th Ward, the part of South Philadelphia that Du Bois studied in the late 19th century, which was a real kind of concentration of African Americans. It's an interesting question whether there's such a thing as an Black Philadelphia building, right? That's actually expressed architecturally. I'm thinking out loud as I ask that question. I don't know. But we don't necessarily have a tour that specifically looks at that.
That's interesting. I know that Visit Philadelphia has done a fantastic job of positioning the African American story through video and attracting specific African American tourists, simply to share the fact that indeed our city does have such a wealth of heritage. But Ivan, love to hear what you feel is a great way to kind of experience that as a newcomer to Philadelphia that wants to learn as much as they can.
Well, I think it's great to go in this order, and thank you, Patrick, for the nod in your question, because in your response, because I was hoping that the African American Museum in Philadelphia can be a hub or a starting point for exploration around African American history and legacies all around Philadelphia and in the surrounding regions. We obviously deal with the objects that are related to the lives of generations of Africans and African Americans in this region. So from those objects, we're able to draw out pieces of the narrative. So, where there is a building or a historic object or some physical evidence out in the world of a person's life or the trials that they faced. In our museum, we try to house the objects that really flesh out the narrative. And that help us to see the whole person who lived in whatever era in history. Like you, I'm not from Philadelphia. I moved here about 15 years ago, and it was remarkable to me that many of the things that I read about in my history books, and in African American history in particular, see sort of their endpoint or their beginning point right here in Philadelphia. So I was walking down the streets and among the buildings where so many history makers I've read about in Missouri had grown up and had made themselves legendary through activism. And so, you know, I like to say I have a fresh pair of eyes all of the time, and I'm perpetually in sort of first time mode. I always want to see the city and all the resources for the true value they present. But I think, you know, I'm helped along by literally not being born and raised here. I think the African American Museum in Philadelphia also works to establish this sort of continuum of related and linked experiences, which everybody's mentioned so far. Some of the most difficult periods of our history that we talk about still show signs. We still see signs and evidence that not all those problems have been solved today, and not everyone is settled on all of those topics. And so we like to make sure that we understand that what's happening now is a direct result of all the things we've learned about yesterday, and will directly influence what happens tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as myself, as a student of history, I'm sensing, and as a relative newcomer to this country and to this city, I'm sensing that for a long time things have been hidden or overlooked, but we're coming to a very interesting juncture where that's no longer allowed, or by our young people, or by our populations, or indeed by our immigrants. And though I think there's a tremendous opportunity for Philadelphia to really shine a beacon in this area, because as we keep saying, there's a tremendous amount of assets here. Some of them are visible, some need more visibility, but now's the time to shine. And I think there's terrific opportunity to grab and seize that. And with that in mind, I'd love each of you to describe a favorite example of our cities showcasing African American heritage. And if you don't mind, those of you who are involved directly with a building or a museum, choose something other than your own. Would you like to go first, Gwen?
Well, in terms of Philadelphia as a whole,
Yes.
Well, one of the things I find fascinating about Philadelphia is to be able to walk down the streets that are named in the history books of where our forefathers and enslaved and free people lived and walked. So it just really brings history alive and makes you understand how these people lived together. They worked together. Some of them had strained relationships, but some of them really had loving relationships, quite frankly. And I think to be able to come to Philadelphia, we are more than just the Liberty Bell. You know, after you go and see the crack in the Liberty Bell, come to Germantown and learn more about how that was the countryside for our forefathers. They would get in their buggies and ride up to Germantown to escape the disease and the misery of the heat in the summertime. In the Drexler Morris House, which is located just off Germantown Avenue, that's George Washington's first city hall, you know. And like I said, to be able to come and visit the Lest We Forget Museum and see actual artifacts from the transatlantic slave trade, leave there and go to the Johnson House and be able to actually walk through the area where Harriet Tubman hid slaves, and then to go to the Cliveden and be able to see how the families lived in that area and in that former. So it's just full of history. And I'd like to also mention that since moving to the Germantown area, we've just been there a year and a half now, we have seen an uptick in our visitorship, and particularly visitorship as it relates to global visitors. We've had people from Bangladesh, many Europeans. They see our card at the visitor center, or they just Google in the words African American history or slavery, and our name pops up, and then they come up to visit us. So I'm very pleased that that is happening. And I also would also like to mention that the 1619 Project brought a lot of attention to the subject of American history and slavery in particular. So there's just so much to see here in Philadelphia, and I'm hope and glad that more and more people are taking advantage of our history.
Thank you, Gwen. Patrick, do you have a favorite that you'd like to share with us?
So if I can't talk about something we've done, I'll give a nod to the Octavius Catto sculpture that was recently installed out front of City Hall. I think everybody at this table knows Catto, but for the purpose of your listeners, you know, Catto was a true Renaissance man in the mid-19th century. He was an educator, labor rights leader, civil rights activist. He was a stud baseball player on top of this. He was sadly killed amidst doing the work that he did in the mid-19th century. So the sculpture of him that's now out front of City Hall is the first public sculpture in Philadelphia that recognizes a historic African-American figure. So it's somewhat surprising that it took as long as it did, and unfortunate, but as you just said, there's a moment to kind of correct, the past decades of overlooking these ideas. And it's hugely popular. Even today as I walk by there, I still see people, taking their picture with Caddo. People who probably have no idea who he is, but now hopefully do.
Yes, it's on the south side of City Hall, right?
That's right.
On the apron outside City Hall. You don't even have to go in. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a terrifically positive piece of art. This young man is sort of flying through the air, his arms akimbo, surrounded by other pieces of sculpture, I think, to emphasize the importance that he played in the role of the African American story in our city. And it really is worth some considerable pondering, I think. In addition to which, we have terrific supporter in the arts in History Making Productions, and they made a very interesting film of his life, which is totally free to watch on the web. History Making Productions as well, you'll find it, and I think you'll find it very edifying and a great piece of filmmaking to watch as well. Ivan, your favorite?
I have my favorite, but I want to actually add on to what Patrick talked about. Our museum has Octavius Caddo as one of several history makers from the 18th and 19th century sort of featured in our core exhibition. We've been talking about him and teaching about him since 2009. I have to say, with the unveiling of that sculpture, that statue outside of City Hall, we've seen renewed interest in his story. And folks looking at different angles, almost as though, adding that physical object and putting forth the effort to honor him in this way gives us a sort of renewed depth of understanding of exactly who he was. We see, once again, the whole person and begin to imagine him standing there. I work in a museum, and I have for a while, but the day they unveiled that, I actually got a little misty, stood out there and teared up. And I'm not a person who generally does that. But a person I'd learned about, 10 years before finally hit home. And I think that's, speaks to the importance of monuments and the things we erect and honor. But my favorite cultural expression, my favorite example of showcase of the city's cultural heritage for me is the Odunde Festival. Which I guess started in 1975, a little bit before I was born. But once again, as a newcomer to Philadelphia, if you want to see, the formal and the informal, family relationships mixed in with broader community relationships, Odunde is the place to go. It's based on a West African, sort of Nigerian Yoruba tradition of celebrating the New Year. It occurs in June of every year. But that's where I saw crystallized civic pride, cultural memory, just making friends with and getting to know your neighbors who are strangers, affirmation for folks of the diaspora, but also an opportunity to experience and enjoy what all these folks of the diaspora have brought to Philadelphia for generations. It all spills out into the streets once a year for Odunde. So for me, it's a remarkable thing that I believe every city should have a version of.
Yeah, that's great that you bring that up. I would also like to bring up, in a similar vein, the Woodland Avenue corridor, where if you feel to go to Africa, you can go tonight. If you go there, you're going to find 5, 6, 7 different restaurants of different cultures. You're going to be able to eat genuine, authentic African food and also meet a lot of African business owners. And it's really exciting to see that area develop.
Sure.
I know the folks in charge have terrific ambition to make this a tourist destination just like Chinatown is in Philadelphia. And I don't doubt that in a few years we'll be talking about that in that vein. And in fact, it's yet another of those hidden gems in Philadelphia. It's a terrific asset and it's a really great aspect to our city. And I'd also like to add to that the fact that this year, I don't know if you are aware, the first direct flight to the African continent will begin on June 4th, you'll be able to fly from Philadelphia to Morocco and connect there with flights to Accra in Nigeria, in Ghana, excuse me, I'm getting my places wrong, of course to Nigeria, to Cairo in Egypt and other places. And that's a really important asset for Philadelphia and a very important asset for our nationhoods, both African American, but also folks that come from the continent who will be able to get home more directly than they are able to do currently. So we're very excited about that. I think some of you are from Philadelphia, some of you are not. An important thing for us to consider and to sort of discuss for our listeners here is how Philadelphia should be viewed by the rest of the world in terms of its African American heritage. And I think there's a lot of strands to that aspect, and would love to hear from each of you how you view that piece of the story. Patrick, would you like to start us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo some of what I've already said, which is that whatever your particular interest, whether you're interested in the early American period, whether you're interested in 19th century industrialism, whether you're interested in 20th century arts and culture, Philadelphia has a piece of that story. And part of that story speaks to the African American experience here. So it's hard to pinpoint one particular place. I think the selling point actually is how comprehensive. It's not like we have one particular industry or one particular neighborhood. It's so deeply intertwined with the identity of the city.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point. Gwen, how would you like to portray that?
I'd like to point out the site of the President's House right there at 5th and Market, right across from the Visitor Center. It's an effigy of where George Washington's house once stood, and it has monitors that features narratives of the formerly enslaved there. It's a very moving piece, and it really makes you, again, understand what it was like for these enslaved people living in the Philadelphia area. And as I said, with Philadelphia being such a historic city as it relates to the country overall, to be able to walk down streets that you can read about in history books like Spruce Street, Pine Street, Delancey Street. I mean, these are names that are actually in history books. And some of these walkways still have the old cobblestones. It's just a wonderful, wonderful experience in Philadelphia. So if you really want to enrich yourself in history as it relates to American history, and again, you can't separate slavery from American history because it's all intertwined. But you will be able to get a good dousing, if you will, of American history by visiting Philadelphia, to be able to walk the streets that our former forefathers and formerly enslaved walked. I think it's very, very appealing to our tourists who come to our city looking for a genuine museum experience.
Yes, and I gather, again, as a newcomer, that in a way, the making of that site was actually an epiphanal moment for Philadelphia.
Absolutely.
Could you talk to that a little bit? I think that's of interest.
Sure. Well, it was difficulty getting it built at first. As a matter of fact, Michael Cord, who is the founding member of
Avenging the Ancestors.
Avenging the Ancestors. See, I don't know how I forgot that. But he was very pivotal in making sure that this part of our history be told. They had a hard time getting the city to agree to do it, but he and his organization spent years making sure that story be told, and I'm so glad that he did. And every time I go by there, it's not a time that I haven't gone by there, that I don't see visitors walking through that area and taking time to listen to the monitors and read the information there, because it really tells the history of the enslaved people that belonged to George Washington.
Yes. So as you know, we're a World Heritage City, and Global Philadelphia staff and partners travel internationally representing Philadelphia. Last summer, we were in Krakow in Poland for a conference of World Heritage Cities, the actual very important conference that happens every other year. And with us came the city representative, Sheila Hess, and Cindy McLeod for Independence National Park. And part of our presentation about Philadelphia was indeed about the President's
Wow.
House.
Okay.
An important piece that we actually had to explain to our audiences because they might not necessarily understand how that came about and why, obviously, why it was important. But it was really nice to be able to share that internationally and tell the story that you've just told. Ivan, would love to hear from you as a newcomer to Philadelphia.
One of the, I try to speak in simple ideas for, audiences, general audiences around the museum. So one of the things that I found useful to say is that Philadelphia history is U.S. history and therefore is world history. Going back, once again for centuries, that so many of our founding truths and myths, the legends and the lies all, occurred, were all written, were all perpetrated right here in Philadelphia. And so, we're not necessarily coming up with new objects all the time from those time periods, but we are making great leaps in our understanding of the context behind the writing of our founding documents, the context behind some of the events that pop up in our history books. So every generation of scholarship adds a new layer of understanding, new on-ramps into discourse for the descendants of both history's quote-unquote winners and losers, and therefore giving us a more complete picture of what Philadelphia really is, what it's grown into, but also what it's come from. For me, the truths and untruths behind those legends of the founding of this country and the fight for this country allow us to get a clearer view of where we've arrived today exactly and how we got here. Beyond that, in this digital age, where not everyone is going to cross the ocean on a flight or on a ship, we still have opportunities to engage in conversations with folks all over the world like never before. And in our case, folks all across the diaspora, and find all the commonalities in our historic struggles and triumphs. Everything from classism to colorism to the evidence of the ravages of slavery on Africans all over the world is now becoming a shared conversation and discourse where we're able to look beyond sometimes our city to see that we have lessons to share with the broader world. And so for me, finding that kinship and being able to put legs to it and put programs behind it has been gratifying. And once again, one of the reasons I stayed here. When I moved here, I knew I was in the right place because of all the potential connections that I could make mentally to help me make sense of the world. I found museum work, which gave me a platform to share those connections.
That's really cool, Ivan. Could you speak a little bit to the digital resources that allows a museum to extend globally? That's of great interest.
Well, absolutely. It's just the way information is shared, ideas are shared. Lay historians, and maybe we ought to come up with other names for lay historians, but people who are engaged in telling parts of the story, either modern or historic, the history that matters to them, are able to piece together their thoughts and ideas through open platforms. And of course we hear bad stories sometimes about mistruths or misunderstood information being transmitted, but more often the way that people connect to each other is to try to share and build understanding, build a body of knowledge together. When you find kinship in the person across the ocean with whom you're exchanging information, there's an even greater imperative to get it right and to do this for one another. We see this in African Americans doing genealogy research and following that up by getting their blood drawn and finding out where in Africa they're from, and following that up now with taking trips across the ocean and engaging in face-to-face cultural exchange with people who could be their cousins. To me, that's exciting. That's science fiction stuff from my childhood that we're living in right now. And it gives me infinite hope for what my children can grow up knowing about themselves that I was only wondering about and I'm still wondering about to this day.
Yes, I don't know about you all, but I do love watching a Henry Louis Case.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
It's the most
My
fascinating show.
favorite. Sure.
It's just great.
Sure.
That's a great segue into another thing that Philadelphia has to offer for this, and that is resources.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure you've got your favorites. Perhaps you'd like to speak to those and just tag one that you find very useful in the work that you're doing for the African American world. Gwen.
Well, in terms of resources, we use our objects, quite frankly, as a resource. We trace where they were made, how they were utilized, on who they were utilized, at the time of the period that they were utilized. But what I can say in terms of the museums in Philadelphia and what makes us unique is that all of our museums in Philadelphia have a shared history, a shared experience, and they are just as diverse as the community in which we live. For instance, I just came from the Philadelphia Constitution Center, who have some of our objects on loan for their new exhibit, Reconstruction in the Civil War. They have some shackles as well as some slave tags that they have there. And I say that to explain how all of our museums really connect with one another. And for the most part, many of these museums have at some point in time taken some of our objects on loan because, again, you can't talk about American history and not at some point acknowledge slavery as it relates to not just American history, but particularly here in Philadelphia. So I just think I just feel very, very free and happy to be a Philadelphian, quite frankly, even though I wasn't born here. I've been here most of my life, and I can never get enough of what I see here and what I experience here.
Patrick, resources in Philadelphia.
So I typically live in the world of buildings and the people who inhabit those buildings. So I'll give a shout out to a resource that we have ourselves. About a decade ago, the Preservation Alliance developed an African American Heritage Inventory that lives on our website. Anybody could access that today. It's not quite 300 properties across the city that we had recognized. There's no doubt more, but those were some of the really kind of high priority places that we had identified back then. It's a kind of broad mix of churches, institutional buildings, individuals' homes. And then this is not necessarily specific to African American history, but if you are interested in a building and you're curious, is it recognized in any kind of formal way? The Historical Commission maintains a map online. We could share these links with your listeners on Global Philly's website at some point. That way you can really kind of verify if this place has been recognized in any formal way. The state maintains a very similar map, a database. Not the most user-friendly website, to be perfectly honest, but they know that too, and they're working on changing that. But it's an incredible resource that I refer to just about every day.
Wow.
And it really is kind of you were asking about one-stop shopping before. It really is kind of one-stop shopping in terms of what we already know and what we don't know, and where there are gaps.
Oh, that's very helpful. Ivan, resources.
Too many to name, definitely. I also want to, just speak about all the scholars and interested people who regularly access the objects in our collection. We have online our holdings from beloved Philadelphia photographer Jack T. Franklin, who, shot and was on hand, on site for many of the biggest moments of the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century in Philadelphia and all over the country. And so regularly we have folks who access and use our objects. I like to think of them as activating the information. And so we also have institutions where we go to gather information and give us another angle and interpretation. City Archives, National Archives, the School District of Philadelphia, even the Free Library, all the universities nearby, are all our friends and collaborators, and trying to breathe a little bit of life into the objects, and to try to tell a more complete story with as many on-ramps to that discourse as possible, using the resources they make available to us. Recently, I've especially become involved with the Civics Education Consortium, who are working to not only activate the information, but then make it something that's a usable tool for our youngest citizens. And so for me, that's something that's exciting. But also, you know, I mentioned University of Delaware, Cheney University, Lincoln University, those last two being our historically black universities right here locally, but UPenn, Temple, Drexel, and all of the others are regular folks on whom we call to gather the objects or the information or to borrow the scholarship we need to do our jobs.
That's helpful. I know that I've been, of course, we're right here on Temple's campus, and hear over and over about the Charles Blockson Library, which I gather is unique.
Major
and
resource.
wonderful.
Yes.
And then the library company also has a very large
Yes.
African American collection. And just recently I saw that the Historical Society
Yes.
had William Still's actual book,
Absolutely.
and they were
Absolutely.
actually had it open on view, I
Sure.
think, just a few weeks
Yes.
ago.
Open to the public.
Right? And I thought, oh, what a wonderful resource that is. And I think, you know, to all of your points, again, the city is just a plethora of resources on this subject that if you are interested, of course, each of you would serve as a resource, but also there's a tremendous amount to be looked at and to be worked through, and lots of opportunity. You know, this, of course, there's pain in this story as well. There's still pain, as you rightly say. There are things that are still not resolved. There are problems that still exist in this world and universe. And I think that the more we can talk about the opportunities and why they matter and what we can do with them, the better off we are. But there are still action and steps to be taken. And would love to hear from you what you feel in terms of what might be next steps, culturally and otherwise, to giving things and our city greater visibility through the African American story. Would you like to go first, Gwen?
Sure. In terms of telling the African American story, it's again has to do with the integration of all of our museums, because each one of us have our own pocket of information that we share, but it's all integrated. It's all integrated. You, of course, like I said, the name of our museum is Lest We Forget Slavery Museum, so people know when they're coming there that it's going to be focusing on slavery. And to look at these objects, it really makes you understand how different it was for those enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought here. But I like to focus on the fact that despite all the oppression and degradation that Africans were forced to endure, I always leave it on what we call our wall of we did it, they hid it inventions, where we show black inventors. And we talk about the fact that it was slaves that literally laid out the infrastructure of America and how much we contributed to the building of America. Just like Michelle Obama said, it was slaves that built the White House, you know? And when you learn not just the inventions done by the George Washington Carvers or the Benjamin Bannekers, but like Dr. Gladys West, the inventor of GPS technology, or Emmett McPherson, the gentleman who created the scientific code that goes with .com. It's really, really interesting, and people leave there, and I always leave them with our slogan, which is, we must remember the legacy of slavery, lest we forget.
Great point. Patrick?
Yes. So in my world, you know, the way that the kind of plot points of history are really kind of recognized is through having a building or a place designated either on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places or the National Register of Historic Places, right? That's kind of the storybook of these very significant plot points in history that are told architecturally or in terms of urban design. And the reality is that there aren't enough places recognized on those lists that do speak directly to the Black Philadelphia experience or the Black national experience. So, you know, that's a challenge I would pose to myself and my colleagues, to make more of an effort to get those places listed, because there's something very significant about that protection, right? It's either local government or the federal government saying that this place speaks broadly enough to our nation's history that it deserves some formal level of recognition and protection. So there's some significance in that, and that could probably be, that love could be shared a little bit more broadly.
Right, and our city has some significant such sites.
Absolutely, and many of them are recognized, right?
So
like Mother Bethel, for example, is on both of these registers that I speak of. The John Coltrane House, Joe Frazier's Gym. It hasn't been a complete blind spot, but I also don't want to overstate that. and suggest that there isn't a lot more work to be done.
Right, and we had a positive story just recently emanate from our city, and that is when the Paul Robeson House mortgage was paid off,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And everyone was very jubilant in that. And of course, we also have the Marian Anderson House, which is another very important asset to Philadelphia. A fantastic lady singing the
Absolutely.
Philadelphia sound.
A great contributor.
Ivan, would you like to answer that question for us?
Yeah, I think institutions like ours, people like us, have to remain creative and innovative in our work. I think we have to continually, discover new tools for doing our jobs, and at a rapid pace try to master them. And of course, I'm talking about some of the digital tools and just new ways of transmitting and collecting information that are coming up every day. But I also think, we're a museum that does collect objects, and both, we're art, history, and culture. So, all things having to do with the diaspora in this region, we collect. I still think that institutions have changes that they can make around how they canonize artists and bring new voices to the table and new visions to the fore. And that's the same thing for collecting historic objects. At times of social upheaval, even in recent history, we see the Missouri History Museum collect objects related to the Black Lives Matter movement and uprising in the St. Louis area, which was a decision, a transition for them. So I think institutions have to have new ideas about what is collectible and what will matter to our audiences in 100 years, and get to the work of trying to interpret all these new objects in new ways. The other thing I believe is we were founded on the occasion of the nation's bicentennial celebration, and basically by a number of African American leaders, but also with the city's involvement, there was an air of paternalism to it, that we would get a museum that we should be happy with. As we move towards America's 250th birthday, and therefore our museum's 50th birthday, we have new agency in our scholarship, new agency in our interpretive practice, new agency in determining how, when, and where our museums will be run. And so I think we have to continue to grow into that role generation by generation and promote new generations of scholars and folks who will maintain and sustain these institutions when we don't know how or when we can't anymore.
Ivan, I love the positive note on which you're ending this podcast. And I think looking to the future and what you've just said is very relevant and can only bode well for the future of our city. In terms of heritage and the lens that I sit upon, I realize and see that not only is this an opportunity for our people, our population, our city to shine even brighter, but it also brings with it economic opportunity, civic pride opportunity, and somewhere for our children to really grow and blossom wherever they might come from. So I think that every Philadelphian should probably listen to you three on this podcast and realize that there's tremendous opportunity in the African American story of Philadelphia and the heritage and the future of our city. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon,
Thank you for having me.
taking the time to come out to the Temple Klein campus, who is our partner in this podcast. And it's been a real pleasure and an honor to speak with the three of you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.